This is Jim Williams with my Hurricane City picks for the 2013 Atlantic hurricane season, which begins on June 1st. Now, normally on June 1st, I will do the hurricane season kickoff show, which will not take place this year. So if you need additional information on my city picks, you can visit hurricanecity.com/predictions, or you can simply watch this video, which will be accessible, the tracking map links on the front page of Hurricane City. Now, before I get to my top five, and speaking of my top five, on average, about 3 out of 5 of my top 5 locations get impacted every hurricane season. It's actually around 2.8 or 2.9%, but it's 2.9, but then it comes out to around 60% accuracy on my city picks, and that includes my top 20 as well. So it's got a pretty good track record. Now, it is all statistically based. I do not use any weather phenomenon such as the AMO, the NAO, all those types of things. I do not use those predictors for figuring out where cities are going to go, because they're simply useless when you're talking something that could happen 3 or 4 months down the road. So all you can do is base it on statistical analysis going back 150 years, figuring out if there's any patterns, if there's areas that get impacted during slow versus busy seasons, if there's areas that are due to be affected because there is a return rate, and very rarely do these cities and islands go over the amount of years that they should be hit. So return rates do mean something despite what you hear on the internet, and there are patterns such as dry spells, wet spells. For example, you could have area that was impacted last year, and there's a pattern of being hit 2 years in a row, that sort of thing. So all these things are factored into these city and island picks. But let me give you an example. Back in 2006, Dr. William Gray and Phil Klotz back from Colorado State predicted 17 named storms back in 2006. We ended up with 9. So that's nearly half of what they actually predicted. So my predictions are based on what they say and what NOAA says. Now this year, Dr. Gray is predicting 18 named storms, and NOAA should probably end up with between 15 and 20, which will come out in about a week or so. But the amount of named storms is huge in figuring out where these things are going to go. But if you go back to 2006 when they did predict 17 named storms and we only ended up with 9, guess what areas were affected? Areas that would normally be affected during slower hurricane seasons, such as the southwest tip of Florida by Tropical Storm Ernesto. It came up through the southern tip and went right up the center of the state and then dissipated as it moved up into the Palm Beach County area and head up toward the center of the state. But the system did skirt closer to the west coast of Florida, which generally gets hit during slower hurricane seasons. Also, back in 2009, Dr. Gray and Phil Klotz back predicted 12 named storms. We ended up with 9, so they were 3 off that year. But again, another slow season, and an area that was impacted during normally slow seasons was Nicaragua by Hurricane Ida. And very rarely does that area get hit except for slow hurricane seasons. So again, there's a pattern there to pay attention to when slow versus busy seasons happen. Now, there's also another misconception out there of people believing that every year I pick the same cities over and over and over again. It may appear that way, but here's the fact on that. For example, South Florida, a lot of people have accused me of picking South Florida cities over and over and over again. The reality of it is, since I've been doing this over the last 10 years, there's been 50 top 5 picks, and only 9 of those have been in South Florida. That's about 14% of the time I pick a South Florida city to be impacted in my top 5. You could say the same thing for the northern Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle area. It's slightly higher, around 20 to 25% of the time I'll pick those areas, but then again, we've been in a very active trend here over the last 15 or 20 years. It's been very active in the Atlantic Basin, and we've had basically neutral ENSO conditions or even La Nina, very few El Nino type conditions. So there's been more active hurricane seasons over the last 15 years, and that's why these areas tend to get picked more often than others, but they're not always picked, and it's only about 15 to 20% of the time. So keep that in mind. Even though you're going to recognize some of the same areas in my top 5 this year, I can't help the fact that we're expecting a busy hurricane season. That's just the reality of it. Now, I am thinking we could probably see a season similar to 2004. Now, here's 2004's tracks. And the reason I'm thinking 2004, we have a lot of similar areas that I have in my top 5, in fact, in my top 20 on this list. And I think we're going to see some long trackers come across this year and skirt through the Caribbean and get into the Gulf of Mexico and or the southeastern United States. And we're also going to see quite a few recurvatures, as you will see that there are a couple locations up there in the Canadian Maritimes that I feel will be impacted as well this year. But I'm kind of thinking 2004 type tracks here. All right, without further ado, let me go ahead and pull up my picks and areas for this year. And this is my map that you can zoom in on the front page of Hurricane City. So let's zoom in. You can just use your mouse scroll here and scroll right in on my top cities, which are in the northern Gulf of Mexico this year. My number one pick is Pascagoula, Mississippi. Now, Pascagoula was picked back in 2005 and 2009. Both times they were affected. And I think I had some notes on that, actually. Yeah, Pascagoula was picked last time in 2010, and it was not affected. So the area has about a 50-50 chance, based on all the times I picked Pascagoula, Mississippi as in the top 5, about a 50-50 chance of being affected. But here's my reasoning on Pascagoula, Mississippi. You can click right over the number, and you'll see that the city has been picked in the top 5 since 2003, more than any other city, 4 times. Out of those 4 times, they were hit by Hurricane Katrina and Tropical Storm Ida. Pascagoula affected mostly during busy seasons when there's an average of 14.30 named storms, and it has one of the highest in the basin as far as active seasons and high numbers. It was hit last by Tropical Storm in 2009. 6 times in history, this is an important statistic, 6 times in history this area has been affected 4 years after a tropical storm. So that's another big part of my statistical scheme, is figuring out the last time they were affected and if there's any patterns in history that would say, okay, when this area gets hit by a tropical storm, generally 4 years later they get hit up by another tropical storm. And the area is statistically due right now for at least a tropical storm, but history tells us none of those 6 times that they were hit 4 years later were from hurricanes. They were all from tropical storms. So if that's any thing to feel better about, maybe if you're in Pascagoula, is that the chances of, historically speaking, they've always been tropical storms rather than hurricanes when they come back 4 years later. My number 2 on the list is Fort Walton Beach, Florida. This is another area that has cracked the top 5 quite a few times. Again, no more than 20% of the time, but the last time Fort Walton was picked was in 2010, and in that time it was not hit as well. But this area was picked twice in the top 5 since 2003 and was hit once by Ivan. Affected during active seasons on general, there's an average of 13.8 named storms. Last hit in 2009 by a tropical storm. So if you go back in history, 5 times in history, the area was hit 4 years after a tropical storm, with nearby Destin 4 times. So both of these areas were affected, with 2 of them hurricanes, 1998 Earl and 2004 Ivan. So it looks like this could be a hurricane situation for Fort Walton Beach. And then, of course, you got to pan out to get to our number 3 pick, which is down in South Florida. Well, actually, South Central Florida. And that would be number 3, which is Vero Beach, Florida. Now, this area has been picked 4 times in my top 5 in the past. 2 of those were hit by tropical storms. The area is hit often during active seasons, again, with an average of 13.8 named storms when they get hit. The area is 1 year overdue, which is big, considering the area rarely is overdue. In fact, a lot of these areas in the northern Gulf and South Florida very rarely are overdue for a tropical storm or a hurricane. They usually are like clockwork, getting hit by tropical systems. This area was last affected by a backdoor tropical storm, meaning coming over from the other coast, in 2008. And 5 times in history, after a backdoor tropical storm, the area has been hit 3 times, with 2 of those by hurricanes. So that's another area of concern this year. And let's go to our number 4 pick this year. And I think we have to go back up into the Panhandle. Actually, no, where is it here? My number 4 pick is... where is my number 4 pick? Oh, yeah, it's Great Exuma in the Bahamas. Now, this was an area that was picked last year in the Bahamas. It was picked once in 2011. It was in the top 5, hit by Hurricane Irene. But even this area was hit by Sandy last year, so it's not always, people. Another misconception is people feel like I never picked a city 2 years in a row that was already hit by a hurricane the previous year. That's not always the case. and this is proof of it. Great Exuma is in my top 5 again this year, even though they were hit by Sandy last year. If it were hit this year, it would be the 3rd time that this island was hit 3 years in a row. So this is not uncommon for this island to be hit 3 times in a row. The island has been affected 4 times the year after a hurricane hit. Also, Exuma Island gets hit frequently in hyperactive hurricane seasons with an average of 14 named storms when hit by hurricanes. So again, Great Exuma Island, number 4. And my top, round off the top 5, we're going to go back over to South Florida and Boynton Beach. Boynton Beach, Florida is number 5 right here, just north of my location here in Delray Beach. And again, do not think that I'm always picking South Florida cities. Again, only 20% of the time since I've been doing this over the last 10 years have I picked South Florida cities. But this area has been picked 5 in my top 5 in the past. It's hit during active seasons with an average of 13.66 named storms when they are hit by hurricanes. Boynton Beach is an amazing 4 years overdue. Now, this is very unusual for South Florida to be this long overdue for a named storm to affect the area. The last time this area was affected was 2006 by a weakening tropical storm Ernesto 7 years ago. And 3 times in history, Boynton was affected 7 years after a tropical storm brush. So there's quite a history of this area being hit 3 times, hit 7 years after a tropical storm brush. While I have this map up, I want to mention my ticking time bomb this year. I'm not going to go over the top 20. Again, if you need to see the top 20, visit hurricanecity.com/predictions. Now, this is normally my ticking time bomb is an area that's way overdue, and at any moment they could be pounded during the hurricane season. My ticking time bomb this year is in an area that's usually hit on a regular basis, and that's Boca Raton, Florida. This year, Boca is based on the only city in the Hurricane City database that will set a record for the longest period without a named storm, affecting the city going back 150 years. So over a 150-year period, this area has never gone this long without a named storm affecting them. So this would break a record, and it's the only city in the database that's close to breaking a record. So Boca Raton, watch out, man. You've never gone this long without a named storm. And, you know, of course, nature always sets records. There's always something to be said about that. But, you know, when you're going to set a record, that's something to be said. Now, as I put up my final image here, which is the areas that I feel are going to be impacted this year and the kind of tracks I expect to happen, I want to mention that the northeastern United States, the areas that were impacted by Sandy last year, I went and did some research on that, and there's never been 3 years in a row where they've had 3 hurricanes hit up there in the northeast in the same exact location. Now, there's been some near misses and systems come in maybe to the mid-Atlantic versus the northeast, but the northeastern United States is very, very difficult to statistically figure out whether they're going to be hit in any given year because you have all these recurvatures, and it's all a matter of timing with troughs coming off the United States and the Bermuda High, the position of it as to whether a system's going to come plowing into the northeast. But all I can tell the people in the northeast is be prepared. You seem to be in a pattern of being affected by systems. And even if one does come in the northern Gulf this year, it could very easily come through as a backdoor system, as a extratropical type system coming in from the inland areas across the northeast. So that you could still be affected this year, but I'm not really anticipating a hurricane plowing into the northeast again this year. It's never happened in history. We had 2 in a row hit the same exact location, so I'm not anticipating Long Island, Atlantic City getting hit by a hurricane, but you could very well end up with a backdoor type system coming up in there. And again, they got the recurvatures, so the Canadian Maritimes also need to watch closely as these recurvatures could affect them on the way out to sea. So that's it. Now, these are my 2 basic tracks I'm expecting this year. A similar track to happen in 2004 with Gene, maybe cutting across the state of Florida and South Florida and then heading up in the northern Gulf. And then, of course, you have the Ivan type track that could pan out this year, something tangling with Cuba, because Havana is also very high up in my list this year at number 11. So Havana, Cuba could also be affected. The west tip of Cuba is overdue, so we can have another Cuba-type situation with a recurvature toward the northern Gulf of Mexico. So anyway, again, that's it for my top 5. Again, if you need all the top 20, you can zoom in and pan out with this map and get the explanations of it on the front page of Hurricane City, or you can simply go to hurricanecity.com/predictions. All right, I hope everybody has a safe hurricane season this year. Again, if you're in my top 5, get ready. And if you don't get hit, you know, there's always going to be areas in my top 5 that do not get hit. But it's a good warning that you need to get ready this year because you're vulnerable, because it's expected to be an active hurricane season. Anybody in the basin, there's always anomalies. Even the areas that get hit during slow hurricane seasons, you could always get hit in an active season. That could always happen. This is just giving you statistical averages to figure out where these things may go. Come visit it at the end of the year. Come visit the video. Come visit the map and see how many of my areas were impacted, because I'm not going to really dwell on it too much during the hurricane season. There's a lot more important things to worry about, like people's lives and safety during the hurricane season, but we'll revisit this after the season is over. Now, my next update video will be on June 1st to kick off the Atlantic hurricane season, so tune in for that video on June 1st. That's it for now. Wishing everybody a safe hurricane season, which begins on June 1st. Thank you for listening.